Hey there, and welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is where I go a little deeper into something that was a part of a recent message here at Sunny Slope Church. I I wanted to do something a little different this time around. Yesterday, I preached on a story in John's Gospel. It's the story. It's found in John chapter 7, verse 53, and it goes through chapter 8, verse 11. It's the story of the woman that is caught in adultery. It's a well-known, it's a well-loved story, but it's also a story that some people have pointed out. Maybe they asked the question if it even is really an authentic story in the Bible. And I'm going to just show you what I mean by that. I'll put my share my screen here for just a moment. Um, you can see here, this is my copy of John chapter 7. And even here, it has this note here. The earliest manuscripts do not include these verses. And so the question is, well, first of all, why is that note there? If it does it belong in the Bible or not? But you can even see it's kind of square bracketed out of the text. And if it doesn't belong here, if it doesn't belong in the text, then why do we read it? Why do we take instruction from it? How do we know, does this mean that the Bible is unreliable? Does this mean that there's stuff in the Bible that is not true and that we shouldn't pay attention to? And I think that's a really good question. I think that's a question that we ought to be asking ourselves. How do we, because if it's true that this passage is just kind of thrown in John's gospel and we don't really know whether it's authentic or not, that that could potentially put the trustworthiness of the whole Bible into question, right? In other words, if we have a text that someone just decided, well, it's a nice story, let's just write it in the Bible, that doesn't engender a lot of support or trust in the authenticity of our Bible. So I thought I'd take a little time to just explain something that we call, it's called textual criticism, and it does not mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean what it sounds like. Textual criticism sounds like we like to pick apart the text and find problems and faults with it, and that's not at all what we do. Textual criticism is really it's a science. It's a very exacting science, actually, by which scholars examine the various copies that exist of the Bible, of the biblical text, and they, using very precise methodologies, they determine what is the most original reading of the text, what is the most reliable, what is the most authentic. Because keep in mind, we don't have the originals of the Bible. In other words, we don't have the parchments or the scrolls where John himself put pen to paper and wrote out his gospel. That has been lost. And we don't even have the copies of John's. We have like copies of the copies of the copies, which might sound very unreliable. Like when you start copying something over and over again, you recognize that you begin to lose some of the authenticity, or you begin to lose some of the accuracy. And so you might say, well, then the Bible must not be reliable because it's been copied. We have copies of the copies of the copies. But the first thing you need to understand is that, in spite of the fact that we have like third, fourth, fifth generation copies and not originals, the consistency is remarkably it stays remarkably much the same. And so, of course, they didn't have photocopiers back then. They didn't have printers. You copy it by hand. But even so, the from one generation to the next to the next to the next, the manuscript stayed pretty consistently the same from one generation to the next. So what scholars do is they look at all the copies that we have, and keep in mind, we've got copies that were distributed all throughout the ancient world. And what they will do is they will compare, okay, we've got manuscripts in this location. They all seem to say the same thing. They'll compare them with manuscripts in a different geographic location. And then they'll find, yep, even they remain pretty well consistent. And then they look at the oldest copies that are available, and they compare those with later ones. And they have a whole system that is really set up to evaluate the validity and the authenticity of and the accuracy of the biblical texts. So let me just I thought it maybe be helpful to just give you an example here. I'm going to show you a couple quick things here. Oops, let's do it this way. I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to put, oh, if I can find it, hang on one second. I'm going to put a picture up here for just a second. I can't find my picture here. Okay, I think we should be back here. You should be able to see this this picture on my screen. This is a copy of the Greek text. And I just took a photo of it from my oops. No, it doesn't want to do that. I just took a photo of it from my Greek New Testament. Now, what you'll see is John chapter 8, the woman caught in adultery. And on this part of the screen here, this is the actual Greek text of the story. Now, what's important, and I think what's relevant here, let me try this one more time. Well, it doesn't really. What's relevant here, I'm going to stop fiddling with that, is down here, this section all the way down here, all the way at the bottom of the page is called, that's the textual apparatus. And what that does is it gives you a list of all of the different sources that have variations of this particular text. But not only that, it helps you then determine the priority of the text as it's written. In other words, you can, it's a little hard to see, but you'll see here, okay, list and note at the top here, that tells you to look at the bottom. And then down here, you'll see, okay, chapter 7, verse 53 to 8, verse 11. And then it says A, what it's doing there when it gives a letter there, it's giving a priority, or it's giving really a grade. It's saying, you know, so in other words, A is the strongest possible support. And it says omit 7 verse 53 to 8 verse 11, and then it lists all of these little tiny numbers and other things. What that's saying is that all of these and every one of these letters here actually represents a different source. All the fragments that we have of our New Testament, even the smallest little fragment that might have, you know, a corner of a page of the Gospel of John, that will be a fragment, and that fragment will have a number. And then we have like large books, and those books are, you know, given also titles. And so every little, what they do, they compare all these fragments, they compare all these books, and then they come to a conclusion. What they say is here, we give the strongest possible support to omitting chapter 7, verse 53, verse 8 through 11. And then it lists all these sources, because all these sources here actually omit this text. Now, the question is, what are these sources? Well, you can see these are, you have to know what they all are, and there's reference works that point them all out. But you need to know that this here is a very, very important one, this little tiny character there. I believe that's the Codex, I believe it's Sinaiticus, but might be, anyways. A, B, C, those are all very, very old copies of the New Testament, and they all omit this particular text. You can go down here and you can see there's the names of Diatessaron, Origen, Chrysostom, Cyril, Tertullian. They also omit it when they write their commentaries. So when they're writing their commentaries on John's Gospel and they get to the end of chapter 7, they actually make no comment about the story of the woman caught in adultery. So they also omit it. Same with all these others. Then it gives some other like mild variations that are suggestive of different, slightly different readings. What's important. So here's what's important. When you look at this text, I'll just kind of sum it up here. So my point is just, here's the text, here's all the different possible readings of the text, and what they say is the strongest possible reading is probably that it was omitted in the earliest text. So we know that it was omitted in the four major old manuscripts of the New Testament, and then as well as in some of the earliest copies of the entire New Testament. So most of the very old manuscripts, and of course older is always better when it comes to comparing your copy of like manuscripts. Older is almost always better because they've been around for the longest amount of time, and they are the ones, they're the ones where the copies come from. So the older you can get it, the better. Other manuscripts, interestingly, include this story, but not in John's gospel. They include it in Luke's gospel. And what that suggests is probably that this was a story that, number one, it was probably a true and authentic story. In other words, in all likelihood, it really happened, because it was so well circulated, because it was so well loved, and because it's in John's gospel, Luke's gospel. It suggests that this was probably a story that everyone knew was authentic and true, but it didn't quite have a home for it. There was no place that that people felt that it really fit. And it, John likely did not include it in his gospel where we have it. But that doesn't mean it's any less true. And so what somebody did, it probably at some point, for reasons that are hard to know for certain, they included it and they inserted it into a copy of John's gospel. So it would have come later on in later copies, but John himself probably did not write it. Now, there may be a way to push back against that. It's possible that because it's possible that it was inserted because John's gospel is talking about the testimonies of different witnesses. And then what you have is, you have in the middle of it, you have the story that sort of bends on the testimony and in the trial of this woman. So it's possible that that's why it was inserted at that particular point, but that's just kind of speculation. We don't know that for sure. Here's what I want you to take away from this. Number one, I think the story is a true story. I have no trouble believing that it actually happened. I am not convinced, as most scholars are not convinced, that John himself recorded the story, or at least that he recorded it where he recorded it. It was probably a story that was floating around and well loved, and was then inserted into a manuscript. Can we learn from it? Can we hear messages on it? Yes, I believe we can. I believe even stories like this can be instructive for us, but we have to at least be aware. And the other thing I want you just to understand is that the process of determining the authenticity of the scriptural text, the New Testament text, is very rigorous. It's not haphazard in any way. The scholarship that goes into determining the truthfulness of a text, the reliability, is very, very rigorous. It's very thorough. And so you can indeed have good reason to trust your New Testament, but it is always interesting to look down at the little variants and just note those as well. You'll find those in your New Testament quite often. 99% of the time, the variants are pretty minor. They don't change the meaning of the text all that much. They don't offer a different understanding of the text. There are a couple places where a word could be, a variant could slightly change the meaning of a text, but most of the time, the changes are pretty mild and pretty insignificant. So anyways, hope that's somewhat informative and somewhat interesting for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll drop more videos as we make them. Thank you. We'll see you next time.